So we left the season in a very interesting place where you're kind of put up with an existential dilemma because you're rooting for your character after all this time because you've finally done something. I guess that's good. It's just kind of, I don't know. I left the season not knowing how I should feel about it anymore.
Good. Good. I always want it to be confusing in that regard, because it's a mixed bag, Good people do bad things, bad people do. I mean, I would rather avoid that essential kind of unanswerable question in most cases about who's good versus who's bad. I mean, it's certainly true that Smith represents that. He represents Nazism, which is obviously bad, but within that, he's a human being. Or at least I'm trying to make him a human being. So that there's someone who had history worked out a different way would be John Smith, the guy, even within his world, he's a hero, but in the alternative, which is our world, you would never question that he was a good guy at all. It wouldn't. He doesn't have, and I always resist the implication that he is someone whose natural proclivities towards violence and evil have been put to good use, but someone who, like most humans, has those things in him, which have been, as it does, which is the job it does, eked out by Nazism, which have been, brought to the fore by the system he lives in, because that's what that system does. So anything that confuses people, I don't know whether it feels like it's working.
Yeah.
It has actually, because the conclusion of both seasons so far, and I understand where you're coming from with the uncomfortableness for an American viewer, it's a little difficult to be sitting and rooting for your character who was a Nazi. And you're going, oh wow. It would have been way worse.
Well, but that's the thing in terms of relativism. I mean, it's one of the difficult, kind of slightly thorny questions that one has when, playing a part like this. What is my responsibility? What's, morally, what was my position? And I, decided a long time ago, instinctively actually, my instinct was that the most responsible thing to do as a human is to portray him as much of a human as possible, because what we need to remind ourselves of is that we as humans are capable of this. We all are, as is demonstrated. All we need to do is be sufficiently convinced of our own victimhood, and it excuses things that were previously inexcusable, and incrementally we can other people to the extent that as victims we become monsters. And I think that's the essential story. Not that anyone's hectoring anyone with a lesson, but that's what it happens to be about. That's what it was about in 1962. Mm-hmm. I wish it wasn't getting more on the nose, but we're not trying to be on the nose. It's just the story is what it, as someone said earlier in an interview. Actually, there were little storylines that they had planned that they had to take out because it seemed like we put them in especially. I don't mean to draw too close a parallel between Nazism and what's going on now, but just in terms of the little things that happened. There was a storyline, about putting up a wall, for example, which got taken away because, I as an audience member would be like, oh, come on, guys, don't patronise me. So certain things, tellingly, you've actually had to kind of tone down because we don't want to see it, which weren't put in for that reason, but end up having parallels in the world.
Without spoiling, because it was coming up to season 3, but what most excited you about some of the themes and the journey that your character gets to go towards in the season?
Well, for me, a continuation of what was already happening, his doubts and the kind of chickens coming home to roost of this pact that he made that he felt was morally the right decision, to side with the other side because he felt that was probably, either we're going to let the Nazis nuke every city or we're going to capitulate and my family will be safe. It's the best thing. To him, he made that decision and he hitched his wagon, to use another expression, I'm not quite sure, to something that, in order to protect his family, that turns around and says, okay, now we're going to have your children one at a time. Well, that seems to be the question. The irony of that, the horror of that, is not lost on him. Whether it ends up being reflected in the writing or not, that's what's underneath. And the idea of being able to tell that story of him, his ascendancy in the world, and his descent internally, and that conflict. I mean, I'm talking a big game. It's probably not coming across. You'll see all of this in my performance. No, not necessarily. But that was what appealed, and still potentially appeals to me about that. And also, the slow cracking open of the idea of other worlds, and a world in which maybe things had turned out differently becomes more of a presence to him, and it has a growing power over it. For various reasons.
Do you think the science fiction elements of the show and pulling on Philip K. Dick's work, do you think that is making the show more powerful, for the viewer, and to kind of turn that otherworldliness up in this season?
I don't know. I'm in two. Yes, I mean in this season, yes, but I'm in two minds about that, because I think that is one of the things that makes it really special. But I think what has made it special is the fact that we've been economical with that. That for the first season, yes, we established this huge conceit that it is an alternate history, an alternate world. But we stick with that long enough for the currency to have some value. If you start leaping around into different realities, flash forward, flashback, dream sequences. I don't know if you've ever seen any films where they have too much of that. Mm-hmm. The effect is, after a while, there's no currency to the moment, because you think, oh, well, it's probably a dream, or he's going to die, but in the other reality he'll be fine. So it just, you withdraw your commitment to it. So they kept that back long enough, and then just slowly started to eke in these elements. And now it's grabbing hold, and this thing is transmogrifying into a slightly different kind of story, which I think is really exciting. I wanted to hold off on the idea of alternate possibilities for Smith until we had a really strong hold on his dilemma in this world before you crack it open, and it's beginning to crack open slightly now.
So when you're approaching this, obviously being a Nazi is probably not something that you're really excited about in the very beginning, but how do you prepare yourself to be that person?
How do I prepare myself to be that person?
As an actor?
Well, I try to do the opposite of what you're assuming, probably. Rather than try to think like a Nazi, I try to think like me as much as possible, whenever possible, because otherwise you find yourself using half-remembered, borrowed, second-hand ideas and letting them inform what you're doing. People would turn up for one day to do a day play or whatever, and you find that they speak in a certain way, and they do this with their gloves, and they walk in a certain way, and everything becomes like Nazi. Whereas if you do the opposite of that every time, again, I'm talking a big game, but if you do the opposite of that, every time you can not have cutlery and have a sandwich, and every time you can do anything that a dad does, or be like an American, or be a bloke, and do which way would a Nazi have their ice cream? Don't do that. So that you just, rather than place yourself at a remove, try to think in terms of how would I convince myself that I was a good guy and do this? What stories would I tell myself? How would I, And if you surround yourself with people who support your bullshit, see fame, for example, you can start to, something that starts as a pose can become real, And I think, it starts off being something he does as a survival mechanism, but it just seeps into his skin.
How much do you think what's happening with, obviously, his son is informing his decisions in the now, in the story?
Well, I think that what's happening with his son and with the connotations for the rest of his family inform everything he does at all times. Sometimes, however, he might find that he's doing things without thinking because it's just become habit. But he tells himself that that's why. Maybe. I just don't have the answer. Maybe that's the way it started off, and maybe it just becomes something automatic. But as far as he's concerned, that's the reason he does everything, and it certainly affects pretty much everything.